5 and 6, me, Mr. A, back with story time for another day, and chapter 6 of Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pearce. Chapter 6, Through a Door. Every night now Tom slipped downstairs to the garden. At first he used to be afraid that it might not be there. Once, with his hand already upon the garden door to open it, he had turned back, sick with grief at the very thought of absence. He had not dared then to look, but later the same night he had forced himself to go again and open that door. There the garden was. It had not failed him. He saw the garden at many times of its day and at different seasons. Its favourite season was summer, with perfect weather. In earliest summer, hyacinths were still out in the crescent beds on the lawn, and wallflowers in the round ones. Then the hyacinths bowed and died, and the wallflowers were uprooted, and stocks and asters bloomed in their stead. There was a clipped box brush by the greenhouse, with a cavity like a great mouth cut into the side of it. This was stacked full of pots and geraniums in flower. Along the sundial path, heavy red poppies came out, and roses, and in summer dusk, the evening primroses glimmered like little moons. In the latest summer, the pears on the walls were muffled in muslin bags for safe ripening. Tom was not a gardener, however. His first interest in a garden, as Peter's would have been, was tree climbing. He always remembered his first tree in this garden, one of the yews round the lawn. He had never climbed a yew before, and was inclined to think ever afterwards that yews were best. The first branches grew conveniently low, and the main trunk had bosses and crevices. With the toes of his left foot fitted into one of these last, Tom curved his hands round the branch over his head. Then he gave a push. A spring and a strong haul on the arms. His legs and feet were dangling free, and the branch was under his chest, and then under his middle. He drew himself still farther forward, at the same time twisting himself expertly, and now he was sitting on the bough, a man's height above the ground. The rest of the ascent was easy but interesting, sometimes among the spreading outermost branches, sometimes working close to the main trunk. Tom loved the dry feel of the bark on the main trunk. In places the bark had peeled away, and then a deep pink showed beneath, as though the tree was skin and flesh beneath its brown. Up he went, up, and burst at last from the dim interior into an openness of blue and fiery gold. The sun was the gold in a blue sky. All round him was a spreading, tufted surface of evergreen. He was on a level with all the yew tree tops round the lawn, nearly on a level with the top of the tall south wall. Tom was on a level too, with the upper windows of the house, just across the lawn from him. His attention was caught by a movement inside one of the rooms. It came, he saw, from the same maid he had once seen in the hall. She was dusting a bedroom, and came now to the window to raise the sash and shake her duster outside. She looked casually across to the yew trees as she did so, and Tom tried waving to her. It was like waving to the he in Blind Man's Buff. The maid went back into the depths of the room to her dusting. She left the window open behind her, and Tom could now see more. There was someone else in the room besides the maid, someone who stood against the far wall facing the window. The maid evidently spoke to her companion occasionally as she worked, for Tom could see her faint coming and going of voices, or hear it even. He could not see the other figure at all clearly, except that it was motionless, and there was the whiteness and shape of a face that was always turned in his direction. That steadfastness of direction embarrassed Tom. Very gradually he began to draw his head downwards, and then suddenly ducked it below tree level altogether. Tom saw more people later, in the garden itself. He stalked them warily, and yet remembered his invisibility to the housemaid with a certain confidence too. He was pretty sure that the garden was used more often than he knew. He often had the feeling of people having just gone, and an uncomfortable feeling, out of which he tried to reason himself again and again of someone who had not gone, someone who, unobserved, observed him. It was a relief, really, to see people, even when they ignored his presence. The maid, the gardener, and a severe-looking woman in a long dress of rustling purple silk, face to face with whom Tom once came unexpectedly on a corner. She cut him dead. Visibility, invisibility. If he were invisible to the people of the garden, he was not completely so, at least to some of the other creatures. How truly they saw him he could not say, but birds cocked their heads at him and flew away when he approached. And had he any bodily weight in this garden? At first Tom thought not. When he climbed the yew tree, he had been startled to feel that no bough swung beneath him, and not a twig broke. Later, and this was a great disappointment to him, he found that he could not, by the ordinary grasping and pushing of his hand, open any of the doors in the garden to go through them. He could not push open the door of the greenhouse, or of the little heating house behind it, or the door on the south wall by the sundial. The doors shut against Tom were a check upon his curiosity, until he saw a simple way out. He would get through the doorways that interested him by following at the heels of the gardener. He regularly visited the greenhouse, the heating house, and used the south wall door. Tom concentrated upon getting through the south wall door. That entry promised to be the easiest, because the gardener went through so often with his tools. There must be a tool shed somewhere through there. The gardener usually went through so quickly and shut the door so smartly behind him that there was not time for anyone else to slip through as well. However, he would be slower with a wheelbarrow, Tom judged, and he waited patiently for that opportunity. Yet even when the man somehow only made a long arm to open the door ahead of the wheelbarrow, wheeled it very swiftly through, caught the door edge with the toe of his boot as he passed, and slammed the door in Tom's face. Tom glared at the door that once more was his barrier. Once more, without hope, he raised his hand to the latch and pressed it. As usual, he could not move it. His fingers seemed to have no substance. Then, in anger, he pressed with all imaginable might. He knitted his brows and brought all his will to bear upon the latch, until he felt that something had to happen. It did. His fingers began to go through the latch. As through the latch, and not his fingers, now were without substance. His fingers went through the ironwork of the latch altogether, and his hand fell back into place by his side. Tom stared down at that ever-memorable right hand. He felt it tenderly with his left to see if it were bruised or broken. It was quite unhurt, quite as before. Then he looked at the latch. It looked as real as any latch he had ever seen anywhere. Then the idea came to Tom that the door might be no more solid than the latch, if he really tried it. Deliberately, he set his side against the door, shoulder, hip and heel, and pressed. At first, nothing gave, either of himself or the door, yet he continued the pressure, with still greater force and greater determination, and gradually he became aware of a strange sensation, that at first he thought was a numbness all down his side, but no, it was not that. Tom gasped, and was seized with alarm and delight. On the other side of the wall, the gardener had emptied his barrow load of weeds and was sitting on the handle of his barrow in front of a potting shed, eating his midday dinner. If he had been able to see Tom at all, he would have seen a most curious sight, a very thin slice of boy from shoulder to foot coming through a perfectly solid wooden door. At first the body came through evenly from top to bottom, and the bottom part came through in its entirety, legs first. Then one arm came through, then another. A little lacking courage. The passing through the door of so much of his body had not been without enormous effort and peculiar, if indescribable, sensations. "Just resting a minute," said Tom's head on the garden side of the door. Yet he knew that he was really delaying, because he was nervous. His stomach, for instance, had felt most uncomfortable as it passed through the door. What would the experience be like for his head, his eyes, his ears? On the other hand, and the new idea was even worse than the old, supposing that, like a locomotive engine losing steam pressure, he lost his present force of body and will in this delay, then he would be unable to move either forwards or backwards. He'd be caught here by the neck, perhaps forever. And just supposing someone came along on the far side of the wall, who by some evil chance could see him. Supposing a whole company came. They would see an entirely defenseless, stern,